Okay, well, I think that we're ready to get started here. I want to start off by welcoming everyone and thanking you for taking the time to join us today. We have such a fantastic panel lined up, and I couldn't be more excited to hear what everyone has to share. I'd like to do a few housekeeping items before I offer a land acknowledgement. We're really fortunate to have a very full room of participants today, which is super exciting. So I'm going to request that everyone keep their microphones and videos off for the panel part of today's presentation. That will just allow all of you to also spotlight the speakers by hiding the non-video participants, which might make the panel a little bit easier to enjoy. I'm also going to set aside roughly 15 minutes towards the end of the presentation for questions. So please make use of the chat function for any questions that you might have. I'm joining you today from the College of Medicine's main campus, which is situated on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. My father immigrated to this country from the Caribbean, which has been impacted by colonization in similar but different ways. And my mother is from a settler farming family in northeastern Saskatchewan. Like most of you, my life has been enriched and sustained by the care and stewardship of these lands by Indigenous peoples. Any conversation around reconciliation requires us to consider our role in the ongoing colonization of this territory. I'd also like to share the land acknowledgement for the university's Tapayoan Indigenous Truth Policy. The land is acknowledged as our mother, the earth. The University of Saskatchewan is committed to honoring and supporting the Indigenous peoples, cultures, values, and languages that belong to the land of Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. The University of Saskatchewan is committed to working towards honoring and supporting these lands and protecting them in a way that demonstrates respect and love. The University of Saskatchewan extends its commitment to the lands and territories of Treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 10 that constitute Saskatchewan, and all the Indigenous people that call it home. We are born to the land and the land claims us. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the Division of Social Accountability is a division in the College of Medicine dedicated to health equity, anti-racist education, community-based research, advocacy, authentic partnerships, and the health needs of underserved and marginalized communities. We engage with and learn from our communities to support relevant, meaningful, and impactful health professional education, research, service, and advocacy. This year, it's our intention to focus on different topics each month, each related to health equity concerns and needs of our community. This month, we are centering our conversation around reconciliation and how we can all contribute to advance this critical work. So I am just absolutely thrilled to be introducing you to our panel today. We're joined by three USASK community members who have all integrated the principles of reconciliation into their work in different ways. Our first panelist is Lynette Epp. Lynette is a research coordinator with the Pewasaskan, I'll let you say that one as well, Indigenous Wellness Research Group, where she oversees the CIHR-funded Sanctum 1.5 Hope Through Strength project grant. Lynette has completed a Master of Science in Community and Population Health Sciences in the College of Medicine at USASK. Her thesis focused on truth and reconciliation in the Indigenous health research, which gave her a different lens to understand the historical context of health research in Saskatchewan. She's over 15 years of experience in health research as a research assistant and research coordinator, and has had the privilege of working alongside First Nations communities for over 10 years. Lynette has lived in Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis her whole life. She's a fourth generation settler of Swedish and Ukrainian ancestry. Next, we have Dr. Gary Groot. Dr. Groot is first and foremost the father of four wonderful boys. He's a professor at the University of Saskatchewan College of Medicine, where he has a joint appointment in surgery and community health and epidemiology. While the Department of Surgery is his clinic home, CH&E is his research home, where he weaves health equity, implementation science, patient-oriented and community research, and realist philosophy throughout his health services programs of research. Dr. Groot's interest in health equity and reconciliation began early in his career in Zaire, Africa, and was rekindled during his PhD at the University of Saskatchewan. He served as the chair of the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer's Equity Advisory Committee and has been involved with many community-engaged health services research projects with Indigenous community. His most recent research with Métis Nation Saskatchewan and the Saskatchewan Cancer Agency explores the concept of culture as a social determinant of health. And our final presenter is Sharissa Hank. Sharissa is an able-bodied cisgender white settler woman seeking to practice anti-racism by learning her own complicity in colonialism and live into her responsibility to change and push for change. Her nursing background in pediatrics and community health, and she started teaching nursing in 2012. Recently, she completed a master's in educational foundations under the supervision of anti-racism expert, Dr. Berna St. Dennis. During and since her master's, Sharissa co-developed and co-delivered anti-racism education for nursing faculty through the support of Dr. Holly Graham, Indigenous Research Chair for the CIHR. Sharissa also recently wrote a chapter in White Benevolence, Racism and Colonial Violence in the Helping Professions, which was released in May of 2022. So I'd encourage everyone to check that out as well. And to get us started off, I think I'll ask you first, Lynette. Can you share a little bit about the relationship between your work and reconciliation?
Sure, I'd be happy to. First of all, welcome everyone. It's so good to see such a wonderful turnout for today, and I'm so honored to be here along with the co-panelists and to be talking with you today. I will start with a little bit of my context, and I don't want to take up too much time, but I grew up in a typical kind of white settler background here in Saskatchewan. Spent a lot of my formative years in Prince Albert, which is a space where many Indigenous people live alongside non-Indigenous people in the community. And looking back now, I can see how fraught with racism that experience really was. And how it was so normalized. And so in my probably mid-20s, I ended up starting reading a lot about Indigenous history in Saskatchewan and moving forward from there. And that is really the journey that started me towards looking at truth and reconciliation in a different way. And so when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports came out in 2015, it really made me realize that reconciliation was not just something that was the responsibility of governments and institutions, but really had needed all the individuals in the society to be involved. And so when I went back to school to work on a master's degree, from my experience working in research in I would say just health in general in Saskatchewan. Of course, if you're in the healthcare field or if you're in research in healthcare in this province, you're going to interact and intersect with Indigenous peoples all over the place. And so I really started looking at like, well, how's the best way to go about this? And how do we do this in a way that's going to start addressing some of the issues and challenges on a systemic level? And so my thesis work under the supervision of Dr. Sylvia Abney, who I see here, hello, really took shape to focus on what it means to look at truth and reconciliation in academic research and in research involving Indigenous people and community health and those sorts of things in the province here. So that's kind of how I got started in the space.
Thank you so much. And I'll pass it off to you, Dr. Groot.
Yeah, that sounds like such an easy question, and I'm not so sure it's actually that easy. Ever since I started working in my career back in what was then Zaire, now Congo, I think I was 23, 24 or something like that. The notion of sort of what is work and what is reconciliation. So my work and my life are sort of intertwined. I can't separate them, and so therefore everything that is for me reconciliation. That's probably a whole other session if you want to unpack what is reconciliation. But that is also intertwined with my life. So they're one and the same, and I don't know how to separate them. When I was at one point, I had the privilege actually of presenting to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on behalf of a not-for-profit organization that I was the chair of at the time when it passed through Edmonton. And that was a very, very meaningful experience for me. And that's sort of how was when the light bulbs came on, and I said, oh yeah, this reminds me a lot of the time I was in Africa. And I hadn't really processed the language or the thinking around reconciliation until that point. And since then, of course, I've read those calls to action, and one of those reads, number 22, we call upon those who can affect change within the Canadian healthcare system to recognize the value of Aboriginal healing practices and use them in the treatment of Aboriginal patients in collaboration with Aboriginal healers and elders where requested by Aboriginal patients. I carry that with me almost daily, and for me, I expand that in terms of my interpretation of that. It is more broad than what you might think of in terms of practices. It's about culture. It's about and for me, reconciliation is at a personal level, that recognizing somebody else's culture and the value of that culture, not just that I can tick a box, but that it has value, and that I want to be in a relationship with people and appreciate the value of their culture and challenge my own. So that's not a thing you do 8 to 5.
I know you know that I have a question about a paradigm shift later, and it sounds like that's something that has certainly happened for you. So I'm excited to kind of hear about a little more of that. Sharissa, go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks, Natalia, and thanks to Dr. Groot and to Lynette. It's an honor to be on this panel with you. It's an honor to be in this room with the 71 other people who are here right now. Wow. And I have many teachers in this room and mentors, so it's really great to be gathered with you all and to have the honor of getting to speak today. My relationship between my work and reconciliation, well, I'm a registered nurse and I'm an educator. Right now I'm focused on anti-racism education. And to me, reconciliation, we can't talk about reconciliation without talking about truth, and especially about the truths that have been hidden by colonialism, active truths, Indigenous people's truths related to the residential school, or some people are saying the residential prison system that people were children were forcibly put into. So I think with the sometimes as a white settler, I think we can want to get to the reconciliation part without spending time in that uncomfortable truth. And there are many uncomfortable truths that we are still learning. And I think listening is a really important part of learning those truths that are historical and ongoing. So for me, that truth part, how I've been learning more of that truth part is really closely tied to anti-racism education and learning histories of this land, and how, to me, getting really at the heart of like, how is all of this colonization possible? How has it been possible? And thinking to the TRC calls to action, like I think it's number 47 about repudiating the doctrine of discovery, and really getting at like this sense of like superiority that colonizers hold as like the root of where we're at right now. To me, like anti-racism has been a way of learning about that. So, and to me, it's a way forward. It's a methodology for engaging in the transformative change that we need to work towards that reconciliation, while uplifting and honoring the truth that still needs to be heard.
I think that you've kind of spoken to this a little bit just in terms of obstacles. Rissi, there's so many obstacles to this work, and so many barriers that we come up across because of the way that colonization has shaped the entire construction of this country. And Lynette, I think you spoke to that kind of a little bit in your introduction as well, just the fact that for many of us, we have been brought up not to see the systems around us that are continuing to inflict harm on Indigenous communities. And so there are so many different obstacles, but I'm wondering if you could tell me about any obstacles that you've encountered in working towards reconciliation, and what have been some of the things that have helped you to overcome them. Sharissa, I'll toss it back to you.
Okay, so I mean, I guess I was already talking about racism, and when I'm talking about racism, I'm thinking about not just interpersonal acts of hatred, but I'm thinking of Ibram X. Kendi's definition of of racism, where it's a group thinking that, or working through policy to put themselves above everyone else. So in the case of our context, white settlers being superior and everyone else being inferior. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying racism. And yeah, so to me, that's an obstacle to the work, but not necessarily in the way that we sometimes think about racism as conscious acts, but as this deeply held sense that white settlers have of superiority, or a sense of entitlement to be here. So to me, racism is certainly what I see as the biggest obstacle to reconciliation. And for me in anti-racism work, a really big obstacle that I identify as uncertainty and the discomfort that comes with that, the destabilizing emotions that come with learning about the harmful history and what continues to happen. So there's a lot of uncertainty and discomfort in anti-racism education. Learners experience that, especially white learners who haven't had to think about racial identity before. So yeah, I would identify those emotions like guilt, denial, anger, defensiveness as big obstacles to this work. And I don't know about overcoming them. I think sometimes it's important for us to not just skip past them or overcome them, but for those emotions to engage with them and to make space for them and to normalize them and figure out what we can learn from them.
I love that. I'll just open it up to either of the two of you if you'd like to jump in there.
I want to mention something that Sharissa touched on in terms of these emotions. When I was talking about kind of my learning journey and starting to realize a different lens on history and understanding the context of Indigenous settler relations in Saskatchewan, those emotions were very real and very uncomfortable. It was not an intellectual journey. It was very much a shaking up of the foundational understanding I had of the world around me. And so very hard, very uncomfortable, many nights just crying over, things that I was learning. There's really hard truths out there. And like Sharissa and Gary mentioned, we can't work on reconciliation if we can't recognize and realize and understand and accept what has happened to Indigenous people in the name of colonization, in the name of imperialism, in the name of the church, in the name of the state in Canada and elsewhere. In terms of other obstacles that I can identify in my experience, I think one of them is, I'm going to call it a two-sided coin of apathy and this sense that this work is oh, good for you, you're doing reconciliation work, but not recognizing that it needs to involve everybody. So I think there's a lot of people out there who think that if you're not working directly with Indigenous people, or if you yourself aren't Indigenous, there's lots of people out there that think that reconciliation is, if you're Indigenous, you should be concerned about reconciliation. Or exactly what Dr. Valley Castro has said here, reconciliation as benevolence, right? And so, yeah, I encounter so many people who are so interested in this work and want to talk about it, but don't necessarily recognize their own responsibility in this area and their own need to do some thinking and do some learning. and move forward in that space. So I think that's a big barrier as well. And one of the ways to fix it is to have conversations like this. So I'm really thankful for this.
Yeah, I agree that conversations like this are what are needed on a regular basis, actually, because I think one of the big challenges for me, at least, I'll speak on a personal level, and that represents also, I think, a big obstacle, if you want to see it that way, but I don't think it has to be, is that reconciliation and understanding and working in this space is not you don't sit down for a week and think about it and it's done. It's a journey, and it's ongoing, and it's hard often to see the subtle injustices that are embedded in the system. So even when you think, oh yeah, okay, I've got my head around this, and then you see something else that pops up and you go, oh, I thought I did, but I don't. If I could just for a moment, if I go back to when I was in Zaire, because I see so much similarity, and I'm sorry, I'll pop back there a few times, I think, but I had this conversation with an elder once when I was starting to work with Indigenous communities, and the light bulbs were coming on about how much similarity there was. But I remember my very good friend and neighbor, Chamoa, said to me as I was getting ready to leave. So I'd been there for 2 years. I from the outside, other than our language, because I couldn't speak his language the way he did, of course. But we looked very much the same. We lived in similar homes side by side. We often ate together. We were good friends. And at the end, he said, you know, you're leaving, and I understand. And he said, but you know, it doesn't matter how much you give up. It doesn't matter how much you learn my language. It doesn't matter how much possessions you let go of. You'll never be the same. And I said, what do you mean, Jamal? And he said, you know, if you need a heart transplant, you'll get on that plane, you'll fly home, and you'll get a heart transplant. If I need a heart transplant, I'll die. And so, you know, and for years, I thought about that in terms of him chastising me, you know, that I was there for the wrong reason and whatnot. And it was only later, years later, that the message that he intended for me really came alive. And that was, yeah, you have privilege. You can't walk away from it. You can't deny it, but use your privilege. Use it to make this world a better place. And so it was kind of like, yeah, you don't learn reconciliation. You don't learn the lessons until you've sat with it sometimes for a long time. So it's messy. It's not easy, and it takes time. So those are the hard things for me.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you all. Where sometimes I do some anti-racism training myself, and sometimes people say, oh, I already took that one, so I don't need to take it again, or I've already learned it all. And it's just such an astonishing statement to me, because I've had the opportunity to engage in these conversations for a long time, and I'm constantly learning something new, and being able to see something from a new perspective, right? And sometimes that involves just having to visit the same idea so many different times before you kind of get to see it with new eyes, which is a fantastic segue, because the second question that I want to ask you about is about this idea of a paradigm shift, or of being able to see things differently. And so sometimes we have that opportunity where there's a moment where things just click, you know, and you kind of understand differently than you have before. So do any of you have any moments like that where you were working in community or something happened and the paradigm shift finally just clicked for you and you're able to look at things from a new perspective? You can just jump right in if you've got an example.
I can start with one. This one actually relates to what Sharissa was saying about truth. And I remember when I was down in Regina, actually, for an Indigenous health class that I was taking for my master's. And I was talking about my project and how I was looking at reconciliation and this stuff. And the class grad student advisor or support person said, "You mean truth and reconciliation?" I was like, yeah, reconciliation. And he's like, no, you can't go to reconciliation without first starting with truth. And it was one of those things that made like, oh, this big aha moment. But then thinking back, it's like, well, yeah, my own journey shows that like really it's this shift in mindset really comes around from starting to learn and starting to understand and ask questions about things we've always been told. So like I mentioned in my upbringing, always having a certain explanation for the Indigenous people in the community who are experiencing poverty, who are experiencing substance use, those sorts of things. And that dominant narrative of it being somehow their fault, or somehow, you know, well, they just need to like get themselves on track and fix things and figure things out and get a job. It masks so much of the actual reality behind why the Indigenous people are often overrepresented in contexts like that. So I think a big thing for me has been asking why and trying to get down to the root of why there are these health disparities and health inequities, why health outcomes are so different, why social outcomes are so different between, you know, comparing Indigenous to non-Indigenous people in Canada. And then you start seeing that it is policies, it is systems, it is structures. And because of, like Sharissa said, this doctrine of discovery and this need to, you know, somehow have this superiority and hierarchy in our society. So we're just recognizing that the more you see it, the more you can't unsee it. And like Gary said, it's these layers of understanding where all of a sudden you're like, oh, I didn't actually see that before. I didn't actually realize that. I didn't understand how something that I've just taken for granted and that seems so normal to me is actually causing and is contributing to these inequities and these outcomes that are just not acceptable in a society that claims to be, you know, first world country that should be good for everybody.
I didn't have an aha moment. It's been a slow grind over years. I'm a slow learner. What can I say? But I think going back to some of the other conversations we had before, I think one of the reasons that is because, for me at least, this kind of work is not something you do in the academy. Actually, it's personal and it's relational, and I can't, maybe you can, but I can't truly be involved with this kind of work if I'm not in relationship with people. Because it's when I'm in relationship with people that I can say, I value you. Like when I'm in a relationship with somebody, I'm not better than you. I'm not above you. I'm equal to you. And when I think about the people that I am in a relationship with that are Indigenous, I value that relationship and I value the things that they bring to that relationship. And I say, well, yeah, there's things that I can learn from you. Maybe there's some things you can learn from me. But it takes time because it's relational. And so that's why there's been no aha for me. It's been as I've built those relationships and started to get to know people one-on-one that I start to see the value in the culture that they represent as well.
I'm really glad that you said that, Dr. Groot, about relationship, because one of my paradigm shifts or aha moments is very closely related. There's I kind of want to share 3 aha moments, but we'll see. Maybe I'll save one for a later question. I started hearing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2012 when the Saskatoon national event happened. And I attended that event and was just like, my mind was blown with the stories that were told, the atrocities, but also the grace and the generosity and the support and like this communal process happening of witnessing and telling, and that, yeah, that was a life-changing event, and I knew that Indigenous people on this land were facing all sorts of hardships, but I, had been taught those narratives, like what Lynette was saying, that really end up blaming Indigenous people for the disparities that are happening, and really ignore the policies and the infliction of harm that has happened at a high up level and at a person-to-person level. And so I think, like, for me, for a long time, well, from 2012 on, I knew that this truth and reconciliation was really important. And I had heard about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. And I went to some vigils to honor the victims, or marches, walks, to pay tribute to the people who had been murdered and gone missing. But I didn't actually have any Indigenous friends back in 2012. I kind of knew a few Indigenous people really peripherally, but building relationships with Indigenous people for me was what made it personal. And I remember being this distinct moment of being at an event with a friend of mine, and we were talking about, I don't know, she said something like, okay, be safe on the way home. And she is Indigenous. And I thought of what safety meant for each of us on the way home. And it was dark out, and we were I don't know, on Avenue C at the food bank. I remember this all very clearly. This is probably from 2014 or something. And it wasn't until then that missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people meant something personal to me. It meant that my friends were at risk. And in a way, I feel really gross that it took that for it to mean more to me. It was important before, but until there was that relationship, I didn't feel like I had any stake in it, or it didn't hit me at that level. So that was a huge deepening to me of what does this mean? Yeah, that feeds into another I guess big aha moment for me when I had the immense privilege of studying under Dr. Verna St. Denis. There was a course that we took that I got to take with her, a reading course where she designed materials for us to learn about anti-racism. And I remember reading this idea, I had heard a lot about individualism versus collectivism. Do we think about ourselves just as individuals, or do we think of ourselves as part of a whole? And kind of fitting these pieces together, this epiphany for me of oh, all my relations, that's what people mean. That's what this teaching is about, all my relations. And I haven't been listening. I realized oh, this is these are my family members. These are my kin, missing and murdered Indigenous women. These are my relations. We are all related. And we are all treaty people. And I think I learning it from a different angle showed me that I hadn't been learning it before to the depths that I needed to. And I still have a lot of learning that I need to keep doing on that level. But yeah, that idea of me as an individual versus me as a part of a family, a community, that was a really, really big epiphany for me.
Absolutely. I hear themes kind of that idea of we're all treaty people, and what does that mean? And this work of decolonization also, of course, it's so important to center Indigenous peoples and their needs and equity, but there are benefits to this work for everyone, and being able to see the ways that we're interconnected and need to care for one another, I think, is so critical. Also, one of the things that I'm kind of cognizant of is that we've invited an all-settler panel today to speak about this issue, and that's not by accident. That was intentional. I think so often the work of reconciliation is considered to be the work for Indigenous people to do, and that's just not the case. I mean, the efforts of the TRC have already happened. We've been given really specific direction in terms of the things that need to change and the things that we can impact. And so that's part of the purpose of having an all settler panel here, is so that we can really emphasize that need for each and every one of us to take individual responsibility for the work. And I am really appreciating the way that Gary's just talking about this being you know, an element of your whole life. Like, this isn't something that you can separate into your academic work or your professional work. Like, realistically, in order for these efforts to be successful, for us to see change, then it's so critical that people are actually able to adopt this as, you know, a value for the way that they live their life. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes before I'd like to open up for questions. So I also, in having conversations, I know, especially around a topic like truth and reconciliation, there is, you know, hardship and things that make this work challenging. But we also get better the more time goes on, and we learn and we can improve. And so from your perspectives, I'd be really curious to hear how you think that we can continue to build our capacity to do this work. And you're welcome to comment on that kind of like as individuals, but you all also work in relationship to health, healthcare, research, that kind of thing. So if you see opportunities there as well, I'd love to hear about that.
I can jump in here first. I think for me, like, building capacity to work towards reconciliation for at least for white settlers, I think we need to build our capacity to be uncomfortable, something I had talked about a little bit earlier. And that is, I think, just something that comes with practice and with like maybe some degree of like choosing to let myself be uncomfortable has like increased my capacity to be uncomfortable and to listen when it's uncomfortable. And like, yeah, to me, it always comes back to that, like that deep seed within us that was planted about superiority, and like identifying that that seed is a lie, and my whiteness doesn't make me superior to anyone. It's just society's decision to do that. And if society decided that, then society can decide something else. If we have a critical mass of people pushing for something new, then we can make that transformative change. But yeah, it's not going to be comfortable. I guess change rarely is.
Building on that, I think another piece of the puzzle for me is recognizing how my tendency, and the tendency that I've been taught in my society, is towards centering myself and centering my own efforts and my own, you know, like someone said, kind of a performative reconciliation. And so recognizing that this work takes an ability to be able to step aside, ability to ask ourselves how we can create space within whatever realms we are able to for Indigenous people to take up more room and take up more space if they choose to in that context. Recognizing that I can't say, oh yeah, you know, reconciliation means that, you know, you get this and this and this, therefore go take it. No. I need to be able to create and hold space in the areas that I'm in such a way that invites and allows, but doesn't expect and demand Indigenous people to be there in the way that I expect or maybe assume should happen. And I don't know how to kind of give an example of that. I don't know if that's coming across But I do think that there's a sense of needing to realize that it is our responsibility, but it's also not something we can do on our own, and we cannot do it by assuming that we have all the answers and we know what things should look like. So again, that goes back to what Gary was talking about relationships and being able to seek out authentic and genuine relationships, not with a mission or purpose of trying to fix things or make things better, but just recognizing that, again, like Sharissa said, we coexist in this space, and what impacts one group or one section of society is definitely going to have impacts on other groups too. So
you like to ask hard questions, don't you? I want to pick up on a concept that Sharissa has thrown out a couple of times now, and that's that of superiority. One of the things that I really like about Indigenous culture that I have that really aligns with my own beliefs and philosophy is that one is not superior to another. So like, it's not just that I am not superior because I'm white. I'm not superior because I'm a surgeon. I'm not superior because I'm a university professor and have a PhD. I'm not superior because of any of those reasons. I'm equal. So when I sit with somebody, at least philosophically, I like to think that I'm equal, but our systems are not well created for that. Our academic systems are not well designed for that concept of equality. I mean, it permeates everything we do. And so how do we start to imagine reshaping that in line with what is my value, but also in value of many of the Indigenous friends that I have? And it means slowly changing our structures to value the things that you see from Indigenous culture that you say, yeah, that's important. And there are pieces of the culture I grew up with that I say, I'd like to hold on to that. But there's some really important parts of Indigenous culture that I would like this to, as a society, adopt. And that's not going to happen overnight, but we need to make movement in that direction. And I don't know the answer in terms of how do you do that? I can do it a little bit on a personal level, but how do you start to have that sort of weave its way into our structures that have been there for time immemorial, at least since the colonizers came? So yeah, I don't have an answer, but I think it's an important question.
I think that that's going to continue to be a theme. There was a comment in the chat earlier where someone said that reconciliation is a journey without a destination. Like, we can't arrive at reconciliation. And I think that that's so true. So much of it is unknown. Most of us are, coming to this conversation from an academic perspective. And I think that there's historically been such an emphasis on knowing and being the expert and having all of the answers. And so it can be really challenging to kind of work against that idea sometimes, and, admit that you still have things to learn, that you don't have all of the answers. But I think just being able to acknowledge that is so critical. So I'm really grateful for everything that you have all shared so far, the things that you do know and the things that you don't, and having humility for that conversation as well, which I think is also something that we weren't typically raised to have. So very appreciative of that. I'd like to make some time for questions now from the audience, from the other participants. If anyone has any questions, you are encouraged to add them to the chat there. And I see that there is one already for you all to consider, so I'll just read that out for you. It says, how do you personally react to witnessing an implied or overt act of racism and bigotry, especially in the workplace?
I'm really keen to answer that one.
Get started.
I think this is about that discomfort. And for me, if I witness it, there's more of a chance that that because I'm white, if I do something about it, people will pay more attention than if the person of color, the Indigenous person and the Black person, or the person of color who experiences the racism says something that they'll be listened to. So, like, to me, I think I love that this session was called, or like that it was framed about responsibility, because I think for me as like a white person, if I witness that, or I'm told about it, even if I don't directly witness it, I think it is my responsibility to do something. And I think like there's so many ways to approach that. And I see like what I see as my responsibility, and that is like kind of in two directions. And I think one of those directions is about disrupting, because racism is very common, especially that subtle implied racism, as you said in your question. I think that that's really status quo and really normalized. And so I think like disrupting that and not letting that happen without it being marked, noticed, made I guess drawn attention to, I think is really important. So the disrupting part, and that doesn't have to be like aggressive, confrontational, high conflict kind of disruption. It can be with gentleness and curiosity, but something that makes people stop and pay attention. And then I think like the other part of that is like, what can I do to support the person who's experiencing that racism, and what do they want me to do? So sometimes it can't happen in the moment. Like sometimes I don't know what that person needs, like, and sometimes it needs to happen in the moment. And like going to them afterwards and saying, oh, that was awful, is actually very hurtful. Like, why couldn't you have said something in the moment? So I think like playing with those two ideas of like disruption and support, and finding how those balance in each situation.
Rissy, I'm going to prod you a little bit here. How, because I know that like we've often, and Rissy and I get to do anti-racism work together, so we often also though talk about like that idea of like white saviorism. So what's the balance there in making sure that you're not also just like coming in as the white knight trying to save the day all the time?
Oh, what a great question. Yeah, that like because superiority of like this like whiteness comes up in me. Like I'm still unlearning and figuring out how this comes up in this way of like white saviorism, or like this exceptionalism, like I'm the good white person here to interrupt racism. And like that's not it's counterproductive to have that mentality and that approach. So yeah, I wish I had a answer to that, Natalia, because I don't know where the balance is, and I like make a lot of mistakes either way of like not taking action because I'm like getting in my head about it and being like, well, I don't want to be a white savior, and at the same time being like, oh, I have some responsibility to say something here. So yeah, it's not me saving the person of color who experienced the racism, but I think it is my responsibility to say something, to disrupt something. And if I'm too scared of doing the wrong thing, or what if this could be understood as saviorism, then I'm making it like about my image instead of about like the harm that's happening. So like trying to not think of myself as like that there's a right answer and that I can find the right answer and solve the problem, but thinking of myself as like someone who can say something and who's gonna mess it up, but being okay with taking an imperfect action instead of inaction.
Thanks. I appreciate you answering my extra questions. Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I think I've on one occasion was so struck by what one of my colleagues said, that right in the middle of the outpatient department with about 50 people, I just said, that's the most racist thing I've ever heard. And the whole room went quiet. But most of the time, there's subtle little comments, there's subtle racist things that it isn't until after I go, oh my God, did they actually say that? And it's almost like it's too late now. So the only thing that I can say is I try and think like we had quite a big event here in Saskatchewan recently, And I sat after that, I was actively involved with that. I operated on one of the victims. And I went to the vigil that First Nations University put on. And I listened, and then afterwards I thought, what kind of things might people say that need a response, and how will I respond? So I sort of play it out in my head, and my response on that is, oh, some elders mentioned this to me. I heard this from my Indigenous friends and colleagues. So it's not coming from me. It's just like, this is what I've incorporated and what I've learned from Indigenous people, just as a counter to some of the things that I do hear. And it usually people listen to that, and I don't think of that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think of that as being a savior. I think of that as sharing what I've heard from Indigenous people.
Well, and I think that one of the brilliant things that you've done there is also acknowledge that some of that wisdom has come to you from elders or from Indigenous people, because I think everything that we have learned about colonization, decolonization, reconciliation, all of those things have been lessons that have been shared with us by Indigenous people. So being able to acknowledge that in these conversations is really critical as well. Lynette, did you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, just maybe one more comment. I think exactly what Sharissa and Gary has said, and this is definitely a space I'm still learning. I tend to not like calling people out, but one of the things that I think we need to acknowledge too is that often these things are happening in spaces where there may not be a person of color present, but it's just kind of the banter that goes on in these spaces that still needs to be called out, even though it may not be specifically directed at or directed towards. Those are still harmful, and they're still acts of racism. And so, like Gary said, finding ways to even just put something out there that maybe changes somebody's typical thought pattern in that situation, because you hear the same tropes over and over, the same excuses or the same kind of assumptions being made of Indigenous people and other people of color. So like Gary said, even just being able to point to something else and be like, oh, well, maybe it's because of this, not that, right? Like to throw something else into the mix that hopefully gets the gears turning, and maybe it's not even that person who said it that is going to be impacted by that, but maybe it's someone else who heard it that is going to say, oh yeah, that was a little bit uncomfortable for me too, but maybe now there's another way I can think about it. Or maybe recognizing that there is something problematic about it is one of those first steps. But still an area that I'm really learning in.
I think that is something that we probably all identify with, is continuously learning. Okay, there's kind of an extra comment question that's related to the first, which says, I often hear from colleagues that they've been in meetings where supervisors or managers make insensitive, if not outright racist comments. Any suggestions for how to disrupt when there is a power differential?
That's a tough one. I don't have an answer.
I'll certainly open this up to any participants that are in the room as well, because I know that so many of you have expertise in this area. So if you've got suggestions, we'd be very open to hearing them as well. I think that finding ways to support the person in the room who might be impacted by the comment is really critical, and showing some solidarity there as well. But also just documenting things and having a good record of what has been happening, because that helps to lend more credibility when concerns are brought forward, kind of going forward as well.
What comes to mind for me is a couple of things that Sharissa said about, number one, disrupting doesn't necessarily mean confronting. So it might not necessarily mean that you have to, take it directly to that person and challenge them or put it out there. And number two, it doesn't necessarily, pros, cons, but it doesn't necessarily have to just happen right at that moment. Like Talia just said, just documenting, finding a way to, say this is not okay, and this is not okay that this happened, and we need to do something about it instead of just letting it slide. And then taking some time and space and having the conversations to move forward. And of course, that's me speaking as someone who has a very low chance of the person being harmed in that context. So I know that that's a lens that doesn't account for the person who is experiencing that.
think in like the context where, yeah, there's a power differential, like a position, like formal position power, especially like it's your boss who says something. I think I view questions as a tool, so curiosity and saying, oh, can you say more on that? Or I'm not sure if I understand where you're coming from. Can you elaborate? Sometimes that can even be enough to get the person to rethink, like, oh, what am I saying? And it could be helpful, but I think approaching with curiosity is a really useful tool for me.
Yeah, there's a comment in the chat where someone said a strategy could also be to ask for clarification. Exactly. Could you explain what you mean by that? And I think that that's so beneficial. Earlier, Manuela, as a kind of like solution to building capacity, commented on things like anti-racism training, literacy on microaggressions. So I noticed that there are a few comments in the chat that have some resources that look like they could be helpful for people. So thank you so much for sharing those. Resources are always helpful, always beneficial from my perspective. We've just got a couple of minutes here, and so I think that before I wrap up, I'm going to ask you each a quick question. Give me like your elevator pitch on this one. But what's your dream for what this looks like, or how we know when we've been successful?
So for me, it's like seeing policies change and seeing the resulting outcomes where we aren't seeing the inequitable stats, where Indigenous people have access and aren't overrepresented in prisons and in hospitals.
I would say getting to a place where the majority of non-Indigenous people in Saskatchewan and in Canada even understand and accept and acknowledge the truth of what has happened and the truth of how we've gotten here and their own responsibility to do something about it. Because then I think that people in every space and every sphere will then, like Gary said, not just as an academic or a professional role, but as a person in the society, be able to notice and recognize and do something about all these systemic and structural and institutional and individual and interpersonal factors that are all contributing to the issue. And I would say the place to start is to like read that TRC report, read those 94 calls to action, read the principles. Calls to action are pretty specific to different industries, different organizations, but the principles apply to everyone. Read the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and sit with the parts of it that make you uncomfortable. Sit with the parts that feel threatening to how you've been able to be a person of privilege and benefit in the spaces you're in.
That reminds me also, we're going to order some copies of the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action booklet from the DSA. So they aren't here yet, but if you're interested in those, certainly shoot me an email and I will let you know when they have arrived. They're really handy to just kind of have around. Gary, go ahead.
I'm not going to answer your question. I'm just going to say ditto to what the other two panelists said, but I'm just going to sort of re-quote Martin Luther King Jr. because I think it's appropriate, and that is that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, and I have to remind myself that all the time, and I think it applies here as well.
Well, that is a really beautiful note to end on here. I just want to like extend my most sincere thank you to all of you for joining us today. I know that you've all got lots of demands on your time, and so I really, really appreciate that. For those of you who are joining the webinar as participants, I want to thank you as well for taking time out of your day to be here with us. Make sure that you stay connected with the division. You can sign up for our newsletter or join us for future webinars. We're making it our intention to kind of feature a specific topic or theme each month. So this month we're doing reconciliation. If you're a student, staff, or faculty member in the College of Medicine, you can join us for our book club on the 27th, where we're reading 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. It's a quick little read, so you still have time to join, I promise. And next month for our topic, we're going to be focusing on disability. We'll have a webinar that is on the 21st, same time. And that one, we're going to be joined by some disability advocates who are going to share about My Healthcare Decisions, which is a really fantastic resource that was developed by self-advocates about getting the care that they need when they're in a healthcare setting. So we're really looking forward to that. Following the webinar, you'll also receive a survey, of course, to provide feedback on today's webinar. And again, just really want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. And hopefully we'll connect with you soon in the future.